Hi, this is Glenn Maurer, and we're here today to do another episode of the Next Step show. In today's show, we're going to have two guests on. Ernestine De Soto, Chumash elder, 6th or 7th generation Chumash.
7th unwritten and 6th written.
6th written and 7th unwritten. And Dr. John Johnson from the Santa Barbara Historical Museum, curator, PhD, who was on the show before that we did about 4 months ago on the Chumash Uprising. And this is
a Natural History Museum.
I'm sorry, Natural History Museum. I knew I might do that. I'm sorry. Thank you for correcting that. It's right on your shirt. Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. I'm sorry. So today's show, because the last show, the half hour we had on the uprising, the Chumash Uprising of 190 years ago, was a little bit constrained in time, as I should have expected. And we got up to the point of the uprising, but we didn't really get into what happened to the Chumash population that was affected by this event, and the change in the government from the Spanish to the Mexican government, which had occurred just shortly before that, and then some other events that occurred in the next 30 or 40 years before California was ceded to the United States as part of the results of the war, the Mexican-U.S. war. But what I want to do was talk with Ernestine about the Chumash historical narrative too, about what it is about the Chumash's view of this that might be not known as well as it should be to the general public, and how the Chumash were affected by the mission culture and the Spanish and the Mexican governments. So I hope we'll get into that. By the way, I might mention that Ernestine is a registered nurse and was on duty till 10 o'clock this morning, and we're shooting this in the afternoon. So thank you for coming in here under those conditions. And there's also a show that you might want to see with Ernestine and Dr. Johnson as a collaborator called The 6th Generation.
Right.
And that's available on Ustream or?
Well, it can be purchased from our museum store in Santa Barbara, or also it's distributed by Documentary Educational Resources, DER, which is based on the East Coast, and they distribute it to anybody who wants to buy it.
Okay. Well, if you did a Google search on it, I'm sure you'd find The 6th Generation, Ernestine De Soto and Dr. John Johnson, and it's quite a compelling story. So let's go back to 1824 and what is commonly called the Chumash Uprising, and I understood from that that there were Chumash peoples in the various missions in this immediate neighborhood who were offended by the treatment by the soldiers generally. Is that your understanding?
Absolutely.
And not so much by the church itself, no, but by the now Mexican soldiers.
Right.
And that Mexico had taken over this area, and it had been somewhat neglected by Spain, as you had told me last time. And so there was a certain tension that built up. The Chumash in the Santa Barbara area, after some battles, fled and into the San Joaquin Valley, and then eventually returned to the Santa Barbara area. Is that a fair statement?
I always look to John on that one. Is it a fair statement?
Well, what does your people's history tell you about why they left, and did they come back?
We did come back on the promise of being freed.
On the promise of being freed?
Yes, unfortunately without land.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to get into. So because last time we talked, Dr. Johnson, I asked you if there were any demands by the natives, like a list of them. You said you were aware of no specific listing of demands, but there was an understanding that they would be treated well and be allowed to be independent?
Well, there was a new Mexican governor of California called Jose Echeandía, and Echeandía wanted to secularize the missions, and had an ordinance or a law that was promoted to give the Indians a pathway towards emancipation from the missions. And there were some Indians who did choose that and became what they called, well, licenciados, correct. And they then were independent of the missions. They were free citizens under the Mexican government. Yeah. But the full secularization of the missions didn't occur until between 1833 and 1835 under a different Mexican governor, right. Jose Figueroa.
Well, this is what I want. I'm trying to get my understanding around this. You said they would be freed, or they would be given freedom, independence, licenciados. But there was some sort of relationship to the mission culture that the Chumash had imposed upon them that sounds to me very similar to what we would think of as serfs in Europe or in Eastern Europe. The idea that they belonged to the mission and weren't free, weren't able to walk away and engage in their own private life. Is that what had happened by this time, by the 1820s?
I think we were able to walk away by then, weren't we?
Well, there was a, I mean, we're talking about the mission period as though it was kind of an evolving situation throughout the mission period. The mission period here locally lasted, 50, 60 years, and yes. During that period of time, so if you're talking about the early mission period, it's a different situation than, in the 1820s. But yes, the idea is that Chumash Indians were, once they joined the mission community, they were, free to join, but once they joined the mission community, then they, and became baptized, then they were in kind of a relationship with the fathers as sort of wards of the mission. And they would need permission in order to leave the mission to go out hunting or fishing or visiting their relatives. But those permissions were regularly given out. So they would, the missionaries in 1800 said that every fourth week, 1/4 of the population would be out visiting their relatives. So they worked 3 weeks at the mission, then get the 4th week off.
Right. But they were obligated to work at the mission and not, so when they decided to, the uprising, and they left the mission and ran over the mountains and established a defensive place over there, they were in trouble with the powers that be, and an army, a Mexican army, was sent to fight them and bring them back, as I recall we discussed. And they, yes. In fact, they defeated one attack, you said, and they were then negotiated and brought back into Santa Barbara. So at this point then, there was still a mission culture that the Mexican government, I think the public should know this, the people watching this should probably get perspective on this. The Mexican government was anti-church. One of the causes of the Mexican Revolution. Mm-hmm. And they took, in fact, they passed a law, I think, saying that all Spanish citizens had to leave Alta California or renounce their Spanish relationships, which caused a lot of the missionaries and the Spaniards who were living here to leave the country in that 1800 or after the Mexican Revolution. And then we had this thing called the Secularization. Mm-hmm. And in 1833, as I read it, about then, the actual government of California, quote unquote, secularized or took away the lands that were up to that point controlled by the churches, by the missions. And they promised, as I heard, to give parcels of this land, a certain standard sized parcel, to the Chumash. Did that happen?
I believe it did, didn't it? With my great-great-grandmother.
So some folks got
yes.
properties, mm-hmm. and they established their own independent lives?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Ernestine's great-great-grandmother was Maria Ignacia, for whom Maria Ignacia Creek
yes.
is named after her. And she was given a large parcel of land on Maria Ignacia Creek. That's why it's called Maria Ignacia Creek, because that was where her mm-hmm. land was located. And that's where the family lived for several generations. Ernestine's mother was born on that property.
Yeah. Yeah. I just mentioned in passing that part of your history is that your mother was the last person who spoke a Chumash dialect?
Barbareño, Santa Barbara language.
So she actually spoke the language.
Absolutely.
Has that been, just I'll go off on a side, has there been a preservation effort to?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have casino money, so no, I'm trying, but just when I have spare time, which is practically none, I'm working to survive and living in front of the Maria Ignacia Creek sign, paying $2,000 a month and taking care of my brain-injured daughter.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry.
But Ernestine has been involved in efforts to, study her language. Her mother left behind a wonderful legacy of a number of Chumash stories and historical accounts that are written in her native language. And Ernestine has these notebooks and has been working with those notebooks and working with linguists. And we've published one a children's book, actually, based on one of her mother's stories, working with a linguist. It's called The Sugar Bear Story. And Ernestine did the illustrations for that.
Oh, lovely. I'll look forward to seeing that. Yeah. That was my question, actually, is there some attempt to keep this language available and safe for the future?
Oh, yes, and I'm going to pass it on, even though my daughter is not able to carry on completely. I'm hoping my granddaughter will, and John will oversee them and carry forth.
Good. So in this period now, we have the secularization of the missions in the 1820s, 1830, early 1830s. Land is supposed to be distributed. Some of it does get into the hands of the Chumash, and some of the Chumash are allowed to be licenciados. I guess that means they were free of whatever obligation they had to the mission and the church, and were free to move about the state. And some of the reports I read are pretty shocking about the treatment of the Chumash under the Mexican and other population that was sort of in charge of California at that time. There's stories about Los Angeles using, which was a pretty big city, I guess, at the time, using Chumash as basically, they put them in jail and ran them out as slaves.
Oh, yes, and they were still doing that in the 60s back in the Southwest when I was there, back in the Wyoming area and Montana area.
1960s.
1960s. 68.
So in the 1960s, in the United States of America, in Wyoming, people put in jail and then licensed out as
well, you'd go bail them out and take them with you, and they had to work the land or whatever it was you wanted them to do.
Wow. And that was invariably going to fall upon the least powerful community, probably the Native Americans and the minorities.
That happened here in Santa Barbara too, actually. There's court records from the 1850s, 1860s that talk about Indians who were, being hauled into jail for having been drunk too much and being brought into jail, and then in order to pay their fine, then they would be leased out to a farmer or rancher to work as a laborer until they paid off the fine.
The articles I read make it sound like it was semi-intentional. They would work, they would get a little bit of money, give them that money on a Saturday, become drunk on Saturday night, and end up in jail on Sunday and go back to work for another week of this type of indentured labor.
Wouldn't make sense because
this is after this is under the American system.
Well, apparently. Well, some of it's in the 1830s, 1840s, but yes, I understood it was more like in the 50s, 1850s. But so anyway, the Chumash did attempt, as I understood it, to create a return to the traditional Chumash village life in Ventura, near the Santa Buenaventura River, and here by Goleta. Can we talk about that?
Is that the Cieneguetas?
Yeah. Yeah, there were sizable minority communities. I mean, by the 1840s, by the time of secularization, the Indian population had declined, so it was actually less than that of the Spanish-Mexican colonial population, and but they were still quite a sizable communities, and so there were communities around the former missions in both at Santa Ynez, at La Purísima, at Santa Barbara, San Buenaventura, all of the missions in fact, of California had descended Indian communities around them. And many of the ceremonies, many of the traditional practices were going on, and the native language was being spoken in these native communities.
And how long did were they successful? And if successful, they don't exist today, so yeah. How long did this attempt to recreate traditional life last?
Well, I think for a number of years, for many decades actually, through much of the 19th century, although the population continued to decline, and as additional foreigners, Anglo-Americans coming in, as well as Mexican people from Mexico immigrated up during the gold rush and so on, the Indian population was declining, and there would be a smaller, as well as this overwhelming number of non-Indians. They became a smaller and smaller minority throughout the 19th century.
Let's go back on
in our local area.
Yeah, and in fact in the state as a whole. I've seen estimates that say that the native population when the Europeans arrived was, the Chumash population might have been 22,000.
Something like that, yeah.
And that was decimated by the illnesses that the Europeans brought, and by some of the predatory behavior of the landholders, and other things. And so by the time we're talking about 1840, 1850, how many people were, Chumash peoples were left?
Well, we actually have the 1852 census, the number of people, and I forget the number off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I saw it somewhere.
They were hundreds, but something
hundreds.
less than I don't know that there were even 1,000 people of Chumash Indians left at that time.
Yeah, the California census in 1850, there was a census attempted, I think, in California after the Americans took it over, and it divided the population amongst people who were identifiable as Mexican or Chumash or whatever, and I think that they lost some of the big city Chumashes, but I think on population, I think they were saying 1,900 to 1,200 people. Does that sound possible?
It could be. That may be about right. Although the 1850 census did not count Indians. They left the Indians out of the 1850 census.
Oh, so it's a little later.
The California State Legislature felt that they were that the federal census had undercounted the people who were existing in the state of California. So they appropriated money to have a second census done. It's called the 1852 California State Census. And in that census, they counted all the Indians. So we do have a record, and I think it's under 1,000 people for the Santa Barbara, Ventura, San Luis Obispo County area.
Okay,
there had been some big epidemics. In 1844, there was a smallpox epidemic that swept through California and took many lives, not only Indians, but non-Indians as well. And so some of these epidemics had really further caused a high mortality among the Indian population.
There were a few other uprisings around the state in the 1830s, 1820s, 1830s, as I understood it. But by the time of the secularization, it seems like that would have accomplished the goal of any uprising or any rebellion instinct, because you had legal status as licenciados or equal peoples on one level. Is that true? Were the natives, in fact, Chumash, in fact, equal in the law in California?
I don't think so.
There were no, because they were still sort of regarded as wards of the state. What happened with secularization is, there was a lot of characterization by the people who wanted to see the mission lands broken up, as this being an attempt to free the Indians. But what actually happened is that the lands that were supposed to be held in trust for the Indians were then taken away and given out as land grants to non-Indians. There were some grants given to Indians, like Ernestine's great-great-grandmother, Maria Ignacia, but there were a lot of lands that were originally native land, belonged to the Indians, and the whole idea was they were supposed to be held in trust for the Indians, but they then were distributed to non-Indians as grants. under the Mexican administration.
I know there's litigation after the Americans took over where there was considerable litigation between claims of ownership of these various lands that had been taken from the mission estates or grants, and then either sold or stolen or just occupied.
Right.
And in the end of that, there were a few apparently, and I was happy to hear this, that your family at least had some property for a while. Do they to this day have this property?
Unfortunately, no.
But it wasn't stolen?
No, I don't think so. It was. My great grandma sold parcels because she wanted to see that her children got good marriages and dowries and so forth.
Okay. So that's good. By the time the Americans come into, we have this war with the United States and Mexico, and as part of the settlement of that, the lands in the north of a certain border are ceded to the United States, and people living here are given the option of leaving and going back to Mexico or staying and becoming citizens. I once read I thought it was interesting, the original California Constitution describes the militia of California as being all able-bodied males of a certain age who are U.S. citizens, or California citizens, or declare their intention to be a California citizen. So implicit in that was that people of Mexican nationality, or perhaps the Chumash, if they weren't already considered to be Californians, could be part of the militia by simply saying that they intended to be that. But I don't know that the Chumash were ever included in the governance of California. Is there any place in California where they had any equivalent status?
Well, by the way, I want to give a shout out to Governor Manuel Micheltorena. We have a street in Santa Barbara named Micheltorena because he was one Mexican governor who gave out land to a lot of Indians during his administration. And so Micheltorena seems to have been, well, he probably was of Indian ancestry himself from Mexico, but he gave out a lot of grants to California Indians. But he was overthrown by the California Spanish population didn't like him, and he was overthrown. But what was your question again?
If there was a place in California, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, Monterey, anywhere in Santa Barbara, where the Chumash gained any kind of equal parity or close to parity with the Europeans and others.
Well, there's one interesting case.
Wait a minute. I saw you shaking your head. So tell us more about that.
Well, no, I just didn't. Well, go ahead, John. I just didn't think we gained anything.
Yeah, what was the status of the Chumash population, let's say in the time of the transfer to the United States, 1850s and on? What happened to your ancestors?
Oh, they pretty well died out and scattered, and us women, which is why the 6 generations is made, were the ones to survive and to hold it together, as I do today, and that's how we continue our history, our families.
There are many dialects of the Chumash language.
Oh, well, yes.
Several. Are there? What is the commonality of the Chumash identity? Do all the various dialect-speaking communities identify as being Chumash, quote unquote?
Well, unfortunately, there are no speaking communities.
Well, I'm sorry.
Outside of the reservation. But then again, that's a linguist to help to impart all of that.
So I get what I was trying to say is that of the present population of Chumash, whatever identifying criteria there is, what do you think the population is today?
Very small, I think. 5,000.
Well, I think that there's probably thousands of people who have some degree of Chumash ancestry, have an ancestor who is Chumash. There was kind of a bottleneck, you might say, by the end of the 19th century. And then, because of intermarriage, and since that time, the descendants of those people who survived by the end of the 19th century number in the thousands today. There are very few, though, however, who actually alive today who heard the Chumash language or any of the Chumash languages being spoken. Ernestine is one of those,
or lived
few
in
living people who...
or lived in these villages, the traditional villages.
Well, I didn't live in a village,
No.
but my family did, yes.
They did.
Yeah. And I should say that each of the former mission Indian communities, you know, Ventura, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, Santa Ynez, you know, there are descendant communities still living in those areas, you know, of the original native population of those areas today.
I understand
that. Yeah.
Well, so, you know, it's a sort of a sad history in many ways. I'm saddened by this recounting of what was apparently a relatively peaceful and nonviolent community that was descended upon, and by intention or otherwise, you know, by just things like disease, European disease, and other things, got whittled down to almost nothing, so that people like yourself look back upon a lost past to a degree.
Yes, that's true, but we still have our heritage back there, and we just have to work harder at regaining it.
Yes.
And I was just fortunate to have my mother.
You were.
Very.
So, Dr. Johnson, what is the overall academic, that's maybe not fair to say because that sounds so callous, but is there when you study the native populations of California and other places, is there a perspective on where the Chumash fit in now in terms of the ethnography or history of California that is more clear than it was 10 years ago?
Yes, I think we know a lot more today than we did 10 years ago because of several reasons. One is the ethnographic work of John Harrington, the anthropologist who worked with Ernestine's mother,
Yes.
grandmother, and great-grandmother, and other Chumash Indians, has become much more widely available. The work with the mission archives and the mission records and other archival sources to shed light on what became of the Chumash population has proceeded. And there's been a lot of archaeological work, too, that's continued to build in this area and continued to increase our understanding of the Chumash experience.
Well, it's interesting to me to hear. I always find more than I thought was there when we engage in these conversations. So I thank you for being here and sharing that with us. I'm sorry that you know we're going to end up with the transition to the American stewardship of California, and it sounds like that was no better for your people than Mexican stewardship or the Spanish stewardship.
No. Still isn't for anybody.
Even to this day,
yes.
It isn't. So we're going to finish up. Thank you, Ali Atachak and Juanita Chatham and Tess Burke for your work in the studio. And we look forward to another episode of this in the future. And maybe we can look more into the present status of the Chumash and what's being done to maintain their culture. Thank you.